People are suffering, and so many of us are conditioned to believe that the nonprofit sector is the answer to all of the social, economic, and environmental problems that we've been dealing with in our society, but they will never be enough to deal with these problems because they were not meant to by design. In recent years, there have been a lot more criticisms of the nonprofit sector, but most of these criticisms tend to focus around a few specific individuals or maybe a few specific issues, like wealthy, rich fucks who use nonprofits to conceal their wealth or maintain their wealth. And usually, a lot of these criticisms come with a disclaimer that's basically saying, oh, well, nonprofits as a whole are still a necessary force for goodwill in our society.
Many of them do great work, feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, but this is not a story about them.
There's even a quote that goes, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. And I'm here to say we should definitely be questioning the role of nonprofits and not just assuming that they are all good for society for them to even exist in the first place. This is not an attack on any individuals that work in the nonprofit sector. Most individuals that get into nonprofit work tend to do so out of the goodness of their heart, for sure. I'm just here to try to encourage you to at least be open to these criticisms for a lot of reasons. If we do really want to see meaningful change in the world, we have to start criticizing the role that nonprofits play in our society, and we have to start looking for solutions outside of the nonprofit sector. And we really need to recognize the ways that nonprofits, more often than not, actually do a lot more harm than good. So with that being said, let's dive in. All of my work on this channel and outside of this channel as well revolves around the nonprofit industrial complex, or the NPIC for short. The nonprofit industrial complex is a set of ties and connections between the nonprofit sector and other institutions in our society, such as the government, for-profit corporations, other industrial complexes, and so on and so forth. All of these relationships that the nonprofit sector has with these other institutions works to perpetuate inequality, maintain the status quo, and it's also a system that prioritizes charitable giving and individualistic solutions rather than looking at social problems from a macro level perspective and looking at ways that we could create systemic change. While nonprofits do provide essential services to communities, they oftentimes operate within this framework that further marginalizes those communities and reinforces existing power structures that inevitably maintain the status quo. This video is actually part one of an entire series where I'm diving into more depth with how the nonprofit sector relates to these other institutions that I mentioned, like, for example, government, wealthy elites, corporations, the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, a bunch of other industrial complexes, and how the nonprofit sector influences and co-opts social justice movements, and so on and so forth. And each of these other videos, I'm going to be diving into a lot more specifics, a lot more in depth, with how these ties all have a symbiotic relationship formed between whatever that institution is and the nonprofit industrial complex. Some of the relationships are mutually exploitative, others are more one-directional with how they exploit the nonprofit sector. My hope in making this video and all the videos on my channel is that we can start to look at these issues more critically and start to figure out more effective ways to create change in our society that actually get to the root causes of these problems and don't just alleviate the symptoms of those problems. I'm just touching the surface on these issues, I know, but all of the rest of this channel is going to be spent and devoted entirely to going into more depth in the future. Please, if there's anything in particular that you are interested in hearing more about, please let me know in the comments below, because I would love to jump on it and just give you whatever topics you want me to cover. Before I dive into the negative effects of the nonprofit sector, I really want to point out some statistics to just emphasize how huge the nonprofit sector really is. So first of all, there are nearly 2 million nonprofits in the United States alone. That's about one nonprofit for every 200 Americans. The nonprofit sector also spends $2 trillion per year. Per year. So $2 trillion is 2.5 times what the United States spends on our military every year, at least for the last few years, which is roughly $800 to $850 billion per year. So the nonprofit sector, just to say that again, spends 2.5 times what our military spends, which is also more than the next top 10 countries combined on what they spend on their militaries. Worldwide, there are 10 million nonprofits. The US makes up about 1 in 5 of those. The United States makes up 4% of the population of the world, roughly, still comprises about 20% of the nonprofits in the world. But compared to other countries, it's also shitty when you think about how low we really rank when it comes to things like our healthcare system, our education system, homelessness rates, and with mortality rates of mothers and babies, especially for women of color. All of these things that we rank super low on, even just like social measures too, like isolation and burnout and stress and all of these other things. And yet here we have more nonprofits. And then as far as the workforce goes, 11.9 million Americans, in other words, 1 in 10 Americans work for nonprofits. It's the third largest employment sector besides retail and manufacturing. On top of the ones that actually have official jobs with nonprofits, 25% of Americans, or 63 million Americans, volunteer for nonprofits as well. If you're an American, there is a high likelihood that at some point you have relied on a nonprofit for something and didn't even know it. Let's dive into the harms of nonprofits in our society. First and foremost, they're made to alleviate the symptoms of social problems without actually addressing them at their root causes, which isn't too surprising seeing as how nonprofits are largely controlled by the government in a lot of ways. So it's not like the government is going to give a lot of grants and stuff to these organizations that are like, yeah, let's radically change our whole fucking society. There's actually an analogy I like to use to describe this role that nonprofits play in our society. Imagine that you have a roof. The roof is supposed to serve as a safety net. It's supposed to serve as the government, making sure that members of society are safe, dry, out of the storm. The storms are like social problems or major crises that the members of society are supposed to be protected from experiencing. Let's say that you have a leak in the roof. Nonprofits, when the roof is leaking, kind of act like buckets to basically be placed under the leak until the roof is supposed to be fixed. But at this point in our society, we have no fucking roof anymore. The floor is just littered with buckets. Buckets everywhere, they are overflowing, and the nonprofit sector, instead of fixing the roof, of course, because that's not the role that they play in our society, but instead of anyone fixing the roof, whether that's politicians or nonprofits or what have you, instead of fixing the roof, we've got fucking hurricane after hurricane, and nonprofits are looking at these storms and saying, oh my god, we need more buckets, oh my god, we need more people to be dumping out all these buckets, and oh my god, we need to count all the drops in the buckets and quantify them so that next year when we count the drops of water in these buckets, we need to make sure that it's less than what it was last year. And oh my god, all of the people that we have running these buckets outside and dumping them out are getting burned out, and we need to do more to recruit more people so that we can burn them out too, and all this bullshit. Like, it is just all bullshit. At this point in our society, we're starting to lose the willingness to be content with this being our system. But at the same time, a lot of the social problems in our society are still expected to be dealt with by nonprofits, and a lot of those problems don't have activists and social justice movements around them. We're starting to see this change a little bit with some issues like homelessness and other issues that we are seeing more people rally around because we've been cornered and left without a choice to in the last few years, especially with COVID and everything exacerbating the problems that we already had. This is basically, though, the role that nonprofits play in our society, placing buckets under a leak when we should be fixing the roof itself. Looking at it from this bucket type approach, it really leads to looking at a lot of issues super individualistically and ignoring completely the systemic changes that need to happen. And our society has historically, and still to a large extent does, tend to revere the bucket work more than the work of fixing the roof. Another major harm of the nonprofit sector at large is that it diverts a lot of resources away from more effective means of social change. Like I mentioned before, the nonprofit sector spends over $2 trillion per year.
Compare what this country spends on policing, which is about $100 billion a year, the federal level. We could end homelessness for 20. We could create a universal pre-K program for another 20, 26. We could eliminate poverty altogether among families with children, all the neglect, the abuse, the hunger, the stress, the mental strife that comes from poverty for $70 billion a year, right? And somehow those never get truly fully funded.
It's not just about the money, it's also about the number of people who do care enough to want to put in the work to help people who need help. And all of those people who are super compassionate and empathetic what our society does is it diverts them into more nonprofit oriented work, and it focuses them on super individualistic solutions that don't work. It's a sector that exhausts them, demoralizes them, and burns them out, which I've got a whole other video on burnout and stuff later that I'm doing, because it's not really burnout, it's actually a capitalist myth of burnout. And most people working for nonprofits are fully aware of this feeling of like you're never doing enough. And it's because the nonprofit sector will never be enough. So that feeling is very justified. I mean, imagine if 25% of Americans who cared about these social problems, who volunteer for nonprofits, instead were taking to the streets and rallying and pushing and refusing to let politicians let these problems continue in our society. And I'm not saying that all of the problems solely are in the hands of politicians, because there is a bit more play than just legislative aspects of these social problems, of course. But on the other hand, though, imagine if 25% of Americans rallied together and said, homelessness is a human right, and we should not let people in our society be homeless when we're spending literally dozens of times more money on war and killing people overseas than we are making sure that people in our own society actually have a safe place to sleep every night. And the nonprofit sector absolutely does reinforce a lot of hyper-individualistic values that America has socioculturally. So many of us are well aware of the harms of hyper-individualism in American culture and American exceptionalism and all these other concepts too that tie in here. And nonprofits basically just use these ideals to further uphold the status quo as well. And speaking of upholding the status quo, nonprofits also help to reproduce capitalist systems as well through all of the work that nonprofits do inherently. And this is a thing that comes from the top down as the way that they have to be regulated, the requirements that nonprofits have, and so on and so forth. I will go into more depth on this later with the video that I'll have on the nonprofit sector and for-profit corporations, because a lot of people ask what's the difference between for-profit corporations and nonprofit organizations. Honestly, they have a lot more in common than the ways that they're different. Like I said, I have a whole video I'm going to do on the similarities specifically with a lot more depth. But think about it this way. For-profit corporations have what they call pain points, which is basically what do people need, or what's a common problem that people face and things like that they use to basically pick out a product or service that they're going to capitalize off of. Nonprofits have pain points too. However, theirs are people's actual fucking social problems that they're dealing with. The very existence of nonprofits relies on the existence of social problems. Basically, nonprofits at large professionalize social problems, and they bureaucratize them. They turn social problems into something that they can build entire organizations of jobs and stuff that are dependent on these social problems existing, which is deeply fucked up. Deeply, deeply fucked up when you think about it. It's honestly, in my opinion, one of the most fucked up aspects of the nonprofit sector. This also really further perpetuates this power imbalance between the people who run nonprofits and the people who are on the receiving end of them, because the people who have the resources and the power in the first place to start and maintain nonprofits over time, they basically decide who is worthy of being helped and who's not, and what kind of help they get and what kind of help they don't get. There are a lot of other ways that the nonprofit industrial complex further just widens the gap between these mechanisms of inequality, but also in terms of funding, whoever funds the nonprofit is who controls that nonprofit. This is extremely problematic when you consider that a significant portion of nonprofit funding comes from corporations and the government and wealthy individuals who definitely don't have the best interests at heart for the people that are marginalized enough to have to depend on nonprofits in the first place. And so to say that nonprofits are inevitably good doers in our society, it's really underestimating how much they contribute to these power imbalances and further marginalizing communities as well in ways that I'm going to talk about throughout the rest of this channel, especially in terms of communities of color and colonization and imperialism and all kinds of other topics that oftentimes, when they are rarely talked about in the nonprofit sector, it's basically a way for the nonprofit sector to co-opt a lot of terms and make themselves sound like they're doing a lot more radical work than they are. And they end up co-opting and hijacking and neutralizing social justice movements at the end of the day. The common denominator, though, with all of the videos in this series that I'm going to be talking about with the relationships between the nonprofit sector and other institutions in our society comes down to the nonprofit sector innately upholding the status quo rather than challenging it. And the way that nonprofits are so pervasively enmeshed in every corner of our society really further entrenches them as the go-to supposedly solution to all of the social, economic, and environmental problems that we have in our society. This is social justice activist perception too. And there's this idea that you can get into activist work and professionalize it through the nonprofit sector in an ethical way in a capitalist system. And that's just not the case. Nonprofits also operate as a means of socially, culturally, and politically controlling dissent. For example, there are a lot of restrictions placed on nonprofits as a structural entity under the government, under the IRS, under certain laws that they have to abide by. There are so many things that they can and can't do in order to maintain their status by definition of being a nonprofit. Some nonprofits have a little bit more autonomy than others depending on the purpose that they have in our society. However, by and large, a lot of times, like, you can't be part of a nonprofit organization and have full autonomy with the kind of voice, with the kind of platform that you provide people. You just don't have that kind of freedom with nonprofits. In fact, a lot of times we see instances where for-profit corporations have a lot more freedom of speech than nonprofits, which is deeply fucked up. I mean, it makes sense because it's a fucking capitalist clusterfuck of issues, but at the same time, a nonprofit who is supposed to be helping people in need and supposed to be serving as, you know, their last resort for having their basic needs met most of the time or ensuring the safety of people, they're the ones that don't have a voice, whereas the capitalist corporations that are basically just exploiting them and causing a lot of these problems have more power with the money that they have and freedom of speech than nonprofits do. Also, in terms of capitalism and the government, nonprofits also serve as a mechanism for social justice movements to be controlled and monitored by the government and be directly surveilled by the government. I'll be covering this a lot more in the future, particularly with the surveillance industrial complex video I have planned. We've seen this with socialist movements, we've seen this with Black Lives Matter, we've seen this with all the way dating back to the FBI with COINTELPRO and all kinds of other issues in between, as recently as FBI raids in the last several months.
The FBI raiding several properties in late July in St. Louis, Missouri, and St. Petersburg, Florida, tied to the African People's Socialist Party.
My wife and I were awake. We were sitting at the dining room table. Flashbang grenades were exploding all around the house. They had jammed our phones. These laser dots from automatic weapons were bouncing off my chest. A large armored vehicle in front of my house. A drone went past our head going up the stairwell. I went outside and was zip-tied. I don't know how many FBI agents there were, but there were a lot of them and a lot of different vehicles. And my wife came downstairs. She was handcuffed behind her back, and I'm asking them why, what's going on. They said that they had a search warrant for my house, and I asked them to see the search warrant. And they conveniently didn't have it on them.
A lot of people think like tinfoil hats and stuff with this kind of shit, but it's real. Nonprofits also have a lot of data security issues in terms of what kind of information they share with the government, and the vulnerable people that are forced to have to rely on nonprofits in the first place, their data is putting them at even further risk, and there are so many other issues with this. Also in terms of how the nonprofit sector operates socially and culturally and politically within the general public, by virtue of the existence of nonprofits in our society, a lot of times just their existence alone as a long-term professionalized approach to dealing with a social problem is enough to make people assume that that problem can't be fixed when in fact there is a solution to it, but it's just being ignored. For example, a lot of nonprofits are based around hunger. We know that we have ways that we could deal with hunger. We very well could provide enough food for everyone. It would benefit our society if we did it, if we fed our fucking people. But if you have a nonprofit that operates as, say, for example, a food pantry or a soup kitchen or something along those lines, which are super common, then what that ends up doing is the prolonged existence where the nonprofit sets themselves up as an establishment that is supposed to just last indefinitely without any kind of exit plan or anything for how they're going to effectively end hunger in the community. Even though a lot of nonprofits will say things like ending hunger one life at a time, and ending homelessness one life at a time, and ending poverty one life at a time, and all this fluffy PR bullshit. They'll say those things, but they don't really mean it. Well, that soup kitchen has been there for 50 years now, and they plan to be there for another 50 years. What ends up happening is people assume that hunger just can't be fixed. They may be meeting the immediate needs of people, but they're not doing anything to address hunger at its root cause. And all of this money and all of these other resources go to maintaining that nonprofit's existence rather than actually going to other solutions that would be more effective, especially considering with a lot of the nonprofits that do exist around hunger, all of them have so many limitations and red tape and all of these other things that prevent people from even getting adequate nutrition or enough food to even sustain themselves anyway on those nonprofits that exist. And having been someone who has had to bounce around between nonprofits just to eat, like it's insane that people are okay with this being a solution and that people justify it as being something noble when they tell you to your face you can only have one meal per week or one bag of really nasty shit, expired food and everything for once a month. That's supposed to last you for a fucking month or a week or whatever. And if you live in an area like I do that's super rural and doesn't have a lot of nonprofits, then you're basically fucked then if you're expected to depend on them for your literal meals that you need to eat. When we rely on things like, food pantries and things like that, we're basically saying it's okay for people to get the bare minimum that they need and have to put in so much extra effort to just scrounge what they basically can and get the bare scraps possible when we very well could fucking address these problems. Like, that's the fucking kicker, is that we have enough to deal with these problems, to end them permanently. And we don't. Instead, the government, instead of fixing these problems, decides to not only cause these problems that exist and not deal with them adequately at all, but also create new problems like overseas with wars and other bullshit that they would rather prioritize causing more problems with than the ones that they plan to ever, in a fucking million years it seems like, solve here at home. So yeah, in a nutshell, I hope that you get the gist that nonprofits and their role in society is not as fucking hunky-dory as people like to imagine that it is. It is not noble that we have a society that is so content with these band-aid fixes at best when it wouldn't take very much at all. Like, that's the thing too. It wouldn't take very much at all for these problems to be eradicated altogether at their root causes. And yet we have a society that is largely content with justifying the work of nonprofits and their existence by revering them as this big, noble, grand gesture of goodwill amongst each other that we have, and it's not. Instead, it is controlled by the government, it is surveilled by the government too, and it works in cahoots with all of these other institutions like the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the food industrial complex, the housing industrial complex, the academic industrial complex, wealthy elites. It works in their favor, it works in the government's favor, all of these other ways that it is so deeply fucked up the role that it has in our society that I'm going to be exploring in this series. And it's just, no, we need to stop talking about nonprofits like they are all automatically assumed to be good. And we need to really start criticizing issues with the nonprofit industrial complex if we're ever going to see any positive change happen in our society. And without this critical analysis of the nonprofit industrial complex framework, we are never going to see the change that we need. And if we do see some progress, we're only going to see it regress in the future as well if we maintain this system that we have. Just as a reminder, not all nonprofits are all bad all the time. That'd be ridiculous to assert. I'm not saying that at all. I have been on the receiving end of good nonprofits. I've been on the receiving end of bad nonprofits. I've worked for good nonprofits. I've worked with really shitty nonprofits. There's a whole range of good and bad out there, just like not all people are all good or all bad either. And there are some nonprofits that are doing extremely radical work in trying to transform our society. But within the nonprofit sector, there are inevitably limitations to what can be done within the nonprofit industrial complex. The goal would essentially be to make it to where we have a society that can deal with these social problems in ways that reduce or eliminate the need for nonprofits to even need to exist. A lot of social justice movements try to operate within the nonprofit industrial complex as well, and I have future videos I'm going to be making on why this is so problematic, but right now we have the resources to end these social problems, and we can't just keep contributing to a system that makes these problems worse and just establishes them as the status quo itself and further entrenches them as these inevitable issues that can't be dealt with when they can be. That's not okay. We need to do more so that we can see the change that we really want to see in the world without it just being fluffy marketing bullshit, basically. So if you want to support my work, I do have a Patreon, so check that out if you like, and thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Liking and sharing, commenting, all of those things also help promote this video being seen to more people. If you're interested in topics like this, I hope you'll stick around and enjoy the rest of the content on this channel to come. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Take care.